thank you all for coming to this that's being hosted by the Therapy and Social Change Network. So tonight we're going to be talking about therapy and activism. Kim is a trauma psychotherapist, supervisor, and director of Black Psychotherapy, which is a London-based mental health service that supports Black and global majority communities through a decolonial, intersectional, and anti-oppressive lens. You can find them in Brixton. Kim teaches pluralistic psychotherapy, convenes spaces for activism and social justice, and researches Afrofuturism and other speculative practices as tools for healing, resistance, and liberation. So thank you so much, Kim, for coming and joining us. My name is Cassandra. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll just be sort of holding the space and guiding us through this evening. So over to you.
Good evening, everyone. So lovely to be here with you, to be in community. And I'm so grateful to Cassandra and the Task team for inviting me. Honestly, it is such a pleasure to be talking about topics that I'm really, really passionate about, that are so integral to my life and to my practice. And yeah, it feels like a real treat, especially on a Friday night. So I'm going to share my slides. So this is a big topic, and I've done what I can to distill this into around 40 minutes. But of course, I had to leave a bunch of stuff out, and this is the thing with this work. We need to, you know, be intentional about what we're bringing, but also kind of grieve what we can't talk about or what we don't have time to talk about, or even what is too painful to talk about as well. So I'm going to start with honoring the lineage of activist practitioners that has pretty much pervaded our profession from, I think, from the beginning, in my opinion, but at least for many decades. We'll be exploring this question of how do we become politicized? What happens to us? And I'll be sharing a bit about me and how I became politicized, inviting you all to think about your context and whether you feel that you're politicized, whether you would like to be, whether you are becoming politicized literally in the here and now in this conversation. And all, options are absolutely fine. There's this endless continuum of engaging with these topics. I'll be talking about the present day activism that I do within Black psychotherapy. We'll be debunking some myths and defining what do we actually mean by becoming politicized? What is that? How do we understand that? And really also coming out of the myth of neutrality and objectivity. We'll be exploring the emotional toll of doing activism work. And I think, especially in the times that we live in, we might be able to really sense that. There's already a general emotional toll as we're navigating the world. And if we're doing activism, that's another layer on top of that. We'll be exploring risk, personal risk, professional risk. Doing activism can be risky. We need to be really aware of that and honest with ourselves about how much risk we can hold, how much risk we would like to tolerate. And towards the end, we'll be exploring the activism that goes on beyond counseling and psychotherapy that has been going on for hundreds of years, and seeing if we can borrow any lessons from other movements so that we don't reinvent the wheel. Because in the times that we live in, we might not have the resources to start from scratch and the time as well to figure it all out. If we can take some shortcuts in order to be able to do this work with more ease, then that might be helpful as well. So let's start with honoring the lineage, the huge lineage of therapists, psychologists who have done activist work and who are doing activist work. Now, I really want to do this from a heart-led place because every time I think about decolonizing therapy or politicized practice, whenever I feel really hopeless, I think about this lineage. And obviously, I couldn't really cover every single person. This slide is kind of limited in terms of space. So I had to be quite selective about, who to bring in. But I'm also going to honor the people who I haven't covered in this slide, everyone who's doing the work right now in ways that might be invisible, facing huge adversity, often really isolated. Let's take a moment to honor their existence, honor their work, and honor their legacy. So I'm going to bring in the first person on the slide, first person on my left, and that's Ignacio Martin Barrow. And he is one of the most well-known psychologists or therapy practitioners who also engaged in political work. He was a social psychologist and a Jesuit priest, and he worked during the Civil War in El Salvador. And he developed what we now call liberation psychology, which is a really broad field. It's expanded so much and it's continuing to expand. It's really, really emergent. But he's essentially the person who kind of kicked this off within the kind of context of our recent past. And he believed that psychology had become way too comfortable supporting dominant systems, and that individuals were being studied and analyzed in isolation while completely ignoring the structural and systemic context. And he urged practitioners to not align themselves with this dominant culture or dominant systems, but to actually be with the oppressed, to be in oppressed communities and with oppressed communities, and to practice from there. And to come out of this idea of being neutral observers. And at the time, psychology was really kind of bought into this idea of neutrality and observing from a distance, and professionals, psych professionals, being the kind of experts, but not having that intimacy with community. And he was really instrumental in actually showing us that there's a different way to be and that there's a different way to practice. And in his writing, he spoke about exposing injustice and transforming it rather than expecting communities to adapt to it. So early on, we're seeing this kind of canon of resistance over adaptation, and the invitation for us to work to support people to get free, to resist oppression, rather than just kind of patching them up so that they ultimately continue being a cog in the machine. And sadly, he was assassinated in 1989 by US-backed forces, and it was a political assassination. So we can start to think about how our activism at times can have consequences. It can be dangerous. We might even face harm, we could lose our lives. And there are very real implications to being an activist. So moving towards this way of being, towards this work, isn't easy. It's not like a kind of romantic thing where we're able to do it without any harm. Sometimes there is harm, and we need to be really honest about that. I think for me, that's really important in these conversations, to not pretend that we can, we will always be okay, because we might not be. And the next person on the moving from left to right is Joseph L. White. And he's been described as the godfather of Black psychology. And again, this is a really big, like liberation psychology, Black psychology is a humongous field, and lots of scholars have contributed to this, way of interpreting Black mental health. And he was one of many who were instrumental in kind of framing it as that. But of course, Black psychology predates this context, and It's, African-centered therapy and African philosophy. It's been around for millennia. And Joseph L. White's work emerged during the civil rights era, and it started to really frame the harm that whiteness can do and the effect of whiteness in the therapy room. He was the co-founder of the Association of Black Psychologists, also known as ABSI, and they are still around, happy to report. Sometimes I feel like you need an activist win when there's an organization that does amazing work that is still contemporary. It's still enduring right now. And they do a mixture of conferences, emotional emancipation circles, peer learning, community. They have a big reach. And they also have a chapter in the UK. So for anyone who's interested in psychology, psychotherapy through a Black lens, I mean, this is an organization that's for Black people, including mixed Black people. You're very welcome to, check them out and join them and get involved with their work. And this association isn't just for practitioners. And I find it really beautiful and heartening when I go to their conferences to be in spaces talking about Black psychology with folks who are not therapists or psychologists, but they're interested. And they bring their own wisdom and their own context, and we can all kind of learn together and be in community with each other. And moving on to another contemporary, so we have Professor Gail Lewis, who is UK based, and bringing in this idea that there are activists in the UK as well, many, including Professor Gail Lewis. But sometimes we might maybe have more visibility of the activists in the US and the work that they're doing. And that can kind of cast a bit of a shadow on the activism that's going on in the UK. So Gail Lewis is a UK-based psychodynamic psychotherapist and Black feminist scholar. She was part of the Brixton Black Women's Group and co-founded the Organisation for Women of African and Asian Descent. And her work links subjectivity with race, migration, care work, and state violence. And her focus is really demonstrating how therapeutic thinking cannot be separated from histories of empire, labor, and racialized governance. And this work points to care in and of itself being political, and whether that's kind of care in how we mother, nurture, survive, hold each other, all of that is shaped by state power and racial capitalism. And the next person to the right is Helen Bamber, who was a psychotherapist. She passed in 2014, and she was also a human rights activist who worked with Holocaust survivors, and she co-founded the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture, which is now known as the Helen Bamber Foundation. And Helen's work explored embedding therapeutic practice within international human rights work. So we're seeing activism in lots of different ways showing up, dynamically and in interrelated ways, but it's almost like each person in this lineage holds a particular kind of slant and context that they offer as part of their activism. And this is because there is no one way to do activism. And we will all have our particular flavor, our particular context, our lived experience, our identities. All of that will inform the kind of activism that brings us aliveness, the kind of work that we might want to prioritize, knowing that we can't prioritize everything. And so Helen's work focused on refugees and survivors of state violence. And she believed that therapy sometimes had to move beyond the consulting room into advocacy and structural intervention. And as a service lead, I'm often really thinking about those tensions between therapy and advocacy, because working with marginalized clients who are from Black and Brown communities, sometimes they might benefit from advocacy. They might be supported by us providing like a letter for their PIP application, or us like supporting them to have whatever they need to have from their GP. And that, for some people in their practice, that wouldn't be strictly psychotherapy. But for me, in this work, it very much is. It's not just about what we're doing in the 50 minutes. It's also about what we're willing to do outside of that, and whether we're willing to, support and be in solidarity in very kind of practical ways as well. And of course, there will be limitations to this. I'm not suggesting we go completely outside of our scope of practice, but there's also some stuff that we can do and that we can offer. And last but definitely not least is Andrew Samuels, and he's just at the bottom of the slide. He's a Jungian psychoanalyst who developed this concept of political psychotherapy, and this idea that the inner world and political life are deeply interconnected. He works with political organizations and emphasizes that democracy itself requires psychological maturity, including the capacity to tolerate difference, ambiguity, and conflict. And I see this often working in activist communities where there's huge conflict and differences of opinion, differences in strategy, and the skills of being a practitioner can be really useful. And that's why we literally Sunday ran our first counselling skills for Black activists 4-day training, where we were teaching these skills to support people to be able to do their political work with more power and care as well. And Andrew Samuels talks about the split between clinical work and civic life, and interrogates whether there is a split, and suggests that perhaps there isn't a split in a way that we might kind of necessarily imagine. So we're seeing a kind of fusion of these two ideas. And he asks therapists to recognize that political anxieties, authoritarian tendencies, and collective trauma all live in the psyche. And for me, this speaks to the current time that we're navigating, where we're seeing huge authoritarianism, huge political anxieties, and we're seeing the impact of how that all plays out. So a short detour into my life. I'll keep it brief, but I thought it might be helpful to explore how I became politicized, because I wasn't born politicized. I actually don't really come from a political family, and life kind of brought me to activism, or activism found me, probably a mixture of both. So, way back in 2017, I was already involved in community work and activism, but I didn't really define myself as an activist. I didn't really see it as political work. I just saw it as stuff that I was passionate about. I mean, I got a sense that it was about kind of being free and how we could all be free, but I didn't have the language for liberation yet. And at the time, I was really into independent press and zine making and like zine storytelling. And I was so inspired by lots of different community groups that had their own zines. And then I thought I need to create my own magazine. And so I co-edited a magazine, which was really, really exciting. And in all of that, I was around Galdem, who started off as a zine, and then they became a publication, and then they went really big, and now sadly that work has come to an end, but they played a really pivotal role for years in exploring Black storytelling, and they were one of the few Black and global majority independent publications that then told particular stories that really spoke to the Black experience. So it was a really, really pivotal time for me. And at that time, I also somehow, I can't even remember how, found this magazine that you can see on the screen, Consented. And they were a collective who also published independently. And they published a quarterly magazine exploring race, mental health, culture, migration, relationships, politics, and beyond. So they had a really broad remit. And I went along to one of their, I guess, meetups. They did these regular events where they spoke about the particular issue that they had published and invited contributors to share some information and context around their particular article. And then we could buy the magazine, which is like super exciting for me. And so I went along to this meetup. I thought this is going to be great. I'm going to love this. I get to, talk to them about how they're printing and all the kind of like geeky stuff. And as I sat there and listened to people talk about essentially very politicized topics or topics through a really politicized lens, I had no idea what they were talking about. The language that they used was so foreign to me. I didn't know what patriarchy was. I didn't know what, they were talking about male entitlement. They were talking about like all sorts of, ableism, disability justice. And I was thinking, I mean, I'm kind of hearing the words, but I'm just not understanding anything they're saying. How these words fit together into concepts feels really, really foreign to me. But I didn't give up and I kept going to their meetups. And this magazine was run by students who were either kind of at master's level or studying their PhDs. So it was quite an academic space. And I had all the feelings of feeling like an imposter, feeling like maybe I shouldn't go because I don't understand anything. And I'm glad I persisted. Over time, I started to get a bit of a sense of what they were talking about, but it was still hard. And it's still hard, to be honest, to this day. Sometimes I don't know what things mean, and that's okay. And that's kind of also informed my activism a little bit because in the spaces that I organize, I tend to invite folks to use plain English as much as possible and explain their terms as well if they can. And that really supports people to be able to access the meaning that we're trying to convey and to not shut people out if maybe they've never heard of, particular concepts. I really try and have a kind of activism that is as inclusive as possible. And as a result of being in that space, I ended up really questioning the world. I had this like these dark nights of the soul where I was just thinking about all my life, my relationships, my work, everything. It's kind of like oppression. Once you see it, you can't really unsee it. And then there are lots of feelings and, in my case, a lot of kind of turmoil and grief. And moving on, fast forward to today, I'm involved in present day activism. So, as part of having a mental health service, we are Black and global majority. That's the focus of our clinical work. But we go way beyond that in terms of the scope of Black psychotherapy. We're involved in justice work, community work, organizing, solidarity. Our Justice in Therapy conferences started off as one conference in Brixton. We've since done 3 other conferences, and we now have our 5th one in April, at the end of April. And we've been exploring how do we get to a place where there's justice within therapy for ourselves as practitioners, but also for the people we support as well. And it's a big conversation. There are lots of strands. And off the back of that, we've been involved in organizing and really supporting strategy and what we need to do to bring this world into fruition. And we also do a lot of trainee advocacy because we are a placement provider. And when Black and global majority trainees come into the service, they typically have lots of stories of racial trauma, microaggressions as part of their course, feeling that the course is really hostile, not feeling safe, not being able to be heard by their tutor team, being shut down. So I realized quite early on that it isn't enough to be a service that offers supervision and some basic training. We also needed to do pastoral care. And that's really about supporting trainees to process this trauma, but also supporting their confidence as well, so that they can go into practice in a way that feels supportive and meaningful for them. And the reason why this activism exists, the kind of spark of it, is this idea that we can't be neutral. Neutrality doesn't exist. We can't be fully objective. No one can be fully objective. And I really like Susie Orbach's quote here, there is no such thing as a neutral therapist. And Susie wrote a book called Fat is a Feminist Issue and many others. She's a scholar with an extensive body of work and a practitioner. So check out Susie's work. And it's a powerful provocation. So if we're not neutral, what does that mean? Does that mean that we are political? Does it mean that we're politicized? And how do we define a politicized practice? You know, in the spirit of accessibility, what are we talking about? So for me, and you might have your own definition, but my sense of what this means is having an awareness of power, how power shapes how we relate to our clients, to ourselves, to nature, to the world around us, to colleagues in services or wherever we might be practicing, how we relate to the space that we practice in, and what do we do with that awareness? Once we're aware, we might need to do things differently. But we also need to be aware of oppression as this invisible cloud that can show up in our relating, in how we think about ourselves, how we think about our clients, in the language we use, in the assumptions we make. And as we think about power and oppression, we will have a very unique kind of blend of intersections that might mean that depending on our positionality, we embody more or less power depending on the context. So, for example, if we're talking to a supervisor, they systemically have more power than we do. When we're working with a client, the client has a lot less power. And not just that, they might be coming into the relationship assuming we're the expert. Or if we have a doctorate, they might assume, you know, we're almost like a kind of medical doctor, that we have a lot of knowledge, and they might give their power away. So part of my practice is this idea of building power. And I talk to my clients, I talk to the team about how, you know, how we can build power. How can we support and be in a co-created relationship where we have that goal of building power. It's also about how we conceptualize mental distress, which is, of course, a personal experience, but it doesn't stop there. It's a relational experience as well. We might feel it in the relationship, but it's a structural experience too. So in my practice, I almost, as a rule, I mean, I use that term really loosely, but yeah, I'm quite committed to naming structural sources of distress, to be able to say, could this anxiety that you feel also be connected to the fact that you've experienced microaggressions for the last 3 years at work? Because it's very unlikely that if somebody has anxiety, their lived experience of being undermined at work isn't somehow connected with all of that. And the client might agree and they might disagree. It's okay. We don't have to agree. It's really about seeing if we can uncover systemic oppression, because it tends to thrive, at least in my practice or my kind of view of the world, it thrives in very covert ways. So I do what I can to make things explicit, to uncover. And for me, that's part of my practice, but to do it with care and competency around trauma, because if we uncover oppression too quickly, it can be really crushing for somebody and for us as well. And it's also about seeing therapy as a potential site of resistance. Why are we having these conversations? Can it be so that we can resist oppression? Can it be so that, we're working together so we can be free, not just for ourselves, but for our collective as well? It can be a site of imagination. I research Afrofuturism. It's my hobby slash I'm now on my second master's doing Afrofuturism because I can't seem to let it go. And I really think about and write about and read about imagination as a radical practice, because oppression will probably feed us this narrative that we should just give up. There's no point in imagining another future. Why would we? And our clients might come into that context with very limited possibilities. So if they're willing, and if we're willing, we can engage in a conversation to expand our collective imagination. And in that, it can be a creative practice to find new possibilities, to explore how else can we heal? How else can we process? How else can we feel this? How else can we be in our full human existence? Sometimes folks ask me why therapists become activists, or why therapists would consider becoming activists. And obviously, I'm not speaking on behalf of our profession, but what I've done on the slide is include some possibilities that I've heard in community with other practitioners, especially practitioners who maybe, like me, they weren't politicized, they don't come from a politicized family, but at some point they found themselves involved in whatever way. And there tends to be one or multiple experiences of witnessing injustice, witnessing oppression. It's like oppression isn't working in its perfect way and hiding. Something triggers an uncovering of something, and the person can see something. They can almost kind of see the system. And they might see different things. They might see, the environment. They might see racism. They might see poverty. They might see ableism. They might see migration. They might see a carceral system. And once they see that, they then might need to make particular choices, or they might want to. They don't have to, but they might want to. And those choices tend to be kind of coming out of that real deep, visceral discomfort. Those choices might be to be different, to align with different communities, to maybe seek a position of integrity, to work towards accountability, to be in community with other people who also have been gaslit by a very subtle yet ever present sense of oppression. Um, they might want to engage in particular materials. They might want to read about it because, reading, listening, talking about it is affirming. And these individuals can become more able to hold the risk that's connected to doing this work. And they might also reject certain pathologizing systems within the mental health field. They might actually, discount them, discount this kind of overemphasis on diagnosis or overemphasis on pathology. And they might start to reimagine how they see their clients or even how they see themselves and their own distress. And they might, get to where Ignacio Martin Barrow got to, which is this idea that people shouldn't be adapting to unjust systems. That is not conducive to mental health. When we become politicized, as we become politicized, we might also notice how we feel. And there are many emotions that can come up in this work. There are many emotions that I experience on a very regular basis that connect particularly to my politicized identity or identities. But typically, it can be a place of feeling rage and grief, a very pervasive, wide ranging rage and grief, because it's not just about connecting to our own causes, but we might then start to empathize with causes that we're not intimately involved with or lived experiences that we don't have. We might also experience shame and guilt, that kind of guilt that we're not doing enough. Because once we get a sense of oppression, then it's like, okay, well, I really need to do something about this. But we have very limited time on this planet as humans. And we have very limited time in the week if we need to hold down a job and pay our rent. So that's when the shame can come in and the guilt. And the shame might also be connected to how we might directly benefit from systems of oppression. We might have privilege, or some aspects of who we are might have privilege, or they might be carrying that more power and more privilege. So, what does that mean when we go into activist communities and we're holding that privilege? We might feel that sense of powerlessness, that feeling of, I'm just nothing in this huge, infinite system of oppression. I'm this kind of tiny speck. We might experience moral injury. So, feeling that the harm that's going on is deeply, deeply harming our sense of what's right in the world, our sense of who we are, our sense of safety, our sense of humanity. And there's a lot around oppression being very dehumanizing in and of itself. And then burnout, of course, because as we try and do as much as we can do, if we have limited resources, and most people do to some extent, we're probably going to overwork, especially if we're trying to do organizing alongside practice. We might notice that we're really fatigued, burning out. And of course, there are more feelings beyond that as well. So have a think about your emotional terrain. And if you are politicized, or if you're moving towards imagining the world through a politicized lens, how do you feel? This is ongoing work, sensing how we are. It's really, really important so that we can try and hold on to ourselves, not get completely overpowered by oppression or by the many disappointments that we're going to face. Like we're trying to organize, but we don't have a venue. We're trying to um, we're trying to do an action, we're trying to protest, but a bunch of people have been arrested, and then that undermines the action. Or anything could happen. But activism is typically about doing things that are not comfortable, that will mean that there'll be some kind of retribution or some kind of suffering. And how do we resource ourselves as best we can, knowing that we can't ever fully resource ourselves either? We also need to be really mindful of risk. This is one of my favorite topics, actually. It's this idea of doing activist work is risky. Can we become really conscious of what those risks are? Because when we're conscious, we have more power and choice in our activism. If we pretend that there aren't any risks, we are likely to get really shocked and harmed when something happens. And, we go through one of the many things that you can see on the screen. We have professional risks, we have personal risks, and of course, for many of us, we can't even separate those things. Because obviously, if we get arrested, that's personally risky. If we're in a black and brown body and we get arrested, that's even more risky. But it also means that we can't see our clients when we're in jail. And when the BLM protests were happening, more recently, the Palestine protests, I've been thinking about, when do I protest? I personally do want to protest. I don't always have capacity to protest all the time, but there's something for me about marching, being in the body, having drums, shouting, holding up placards that feels very affirming. It's a way that I feel that I start to, build some energy, build power, and be in solidarity and community with other people. But obviously, should I get arrested, there are big implications for me, as a therapist, as a practicing therapist, as a service lead. So I need to think that through. I can't just go and protest and think, you know what, it'll be fine. We've seen how people get arrested when they protest peacefully. We've seen that a lot in the last, couple of years. So I need to have conversations. I need to have, conversations with my team. I might need to talk to my supervisor. I might need to talk to peers. I might need to confront the possibility that given my intersections, if I did get arrested, I would probably find that physically, mentally, psychologically very taxing and very traumatic. So there are lots of things that I need to consider. And that's just one thing. So beyond that, we have the risk of legal action, the risk of people complaining. As a Black and global majority mental health service that doesn't work with white people, we are holding the possibility that somebody will sue us pretty much every day. That's a risk we need to carry. That's a risk that I need to carry and that I need to contain and still find a way forward and be able to still, do the work that we do and still organize. So it's important that we meet risk without being completely paralyzed by it. Because if we collapse, if we think, it's all too risky, so I'm going to do nothing, there are implications around doing nothing as well. So these are some questions for you to think about. How much risk are you willing to tolerate? What are your boundaries around risk? And if you can have a clear focus and intention for your activism, typically there's more power in it. And we also need to accept that there will be limitations to what we can do. We won't be able to do everything that we would want to do in our lifetime. We need to think about what others have done and not assume that we're alone trying to navigate this world, because we're not. And the more we can draw on wisdom systems and knowledge, the more hope there is, and the more affirmation, normalization, and practical, sometimes real practical guidelines and guidance. So these are some books on the screen that you might want to think about. You know, if you maybe haven't engaged with activism and you're thinking, where do I start? You could start here. There are many more books. Just thought I'd kind of give us a little bit of a taster. And in terms of movements and how I have brought them into my practice, recently I've been thinking a lot about disability justice and the lessons from many decades of disability activism. And these are the principles of disability justice. So thinking about whether our movements, our communities, our groups are led by those who are most impacted. And if not, why not? And who's at the table and who isn't and why? Also, cross-movement solidarity. Often I'm in spaces where I might be one of the few therapists. And I'm actually the happiest in those places because I'm doing cross-movement solidarity and cross-movement organizing. I'm learning a lot from those contexts. I'm really, letting folks know what I'm doing or what we're doing in support, in solidarity, and we're in this kind of mutuality together. And it's really special. And this idea of sustainability, how can our work be sustainable? How can our organizing be sustainable? Because there's so much activist burnout, and folks who are chronically ill and identify as having disabilities might struggle with their energy, they might struggle with an inaccessible world, they might be in pain, they might have to live with ableism every single day. So there are key learnings from the disability justice movement in terms of pacing, energy management, sustainability. We can take those lessons and apply them to our activism, to our context. And I'm going to bring this to a close now. I've already gone over a little bit, but some more lessons. You can also read this in the slides, they'll be circulated. There are plenty more lessons from movements. There's a lot out there, including how we rotate roles within the work that we do, knowing that we might have a particular preference to do a particular thing, but we might also want to rest at times and we need someone else to step in. Or we might need to work in very dynamic and complementary ways with each other. And role rotation, that comes from student nonviolent coordinating and organizing, Occupy Wall Street. It's this idea that we can't do everything all the time. And actually, when we try, we burn out. This idea of rest as resistance comes from Black feminist scholarship, groups like the Nap Ministry, talking about sit-ins and lie-ins. And there's a long history of Black liberation movements, organizing in churches just to sleep, just to rest. But if we sleep together and rest together, we're safer. We can look after each other. Distributed leadership. So as we organize in community and spend time with each other, how do we share power? Who decides what? And do we have consciousness and awareness of that? political education, that's a big one. It's one that I've been thinking about recently a lot. In particular, the Black Panthers, who I believe had 2 hours of mandatory political education a day. That was necessary for their organizing. And I feel like often we're missing knowledge that might make our organizing more powerful, more strategic. And that knowledge comes from our activist ancestors. And if we can, engage in education, it might not be possible for us to do 2 hours. It might not be realistic, or we might not even have the privilege, but we might have 10 minutes or 20 minutes. We can listen to a podcast. And relationship building. So one of the things that I find quite sad doing activism in therapy spaces is that we're really siloed. We're still really isolated. We might be in our practice, really, really isolated, or we come into community, but we still hold really isolated positions, or we're in one group and we're not creating deep networks of intimacy with other groups. And as a service, I and we have a collective intention to go way out of our context and create these relationships and create this intimacy with other people. And this is the part of my job that I love the most. It's both activism and work, to really get to know people, get to know their work, share resources, really get curious about, what other groups are doing, find ways for us to share information and support each other. And these are some questions to consider, and you can do this in your own time. But have a think about how your practice is already politicized, because it's possible that, especially if you think that you're not politicized, you might be already. And often we're not starting from scratch. We can build on the work that we're already doing. And that can be a hopeful place. And I'm done, folks. Thank you all so much. Contact details are on the screen for anyone who would like to reach out. Of course, solidarity is important. So welcoming, and yeah, any comments or questions, there'll be time for us to be in conversation now and also after the break. But if anyone wants to ask me anything, perhaps kind of away from this forum, you're very welcome to email and I'll get back to you. Okay, thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was so generous and important. And I sat here just wondering if we could maybe take 5 minutes now to break and then come back at 6 to continue the conversation, because I'm sure that people have so much and 5 minutes doesn't feel like nearly enough time to scratch the surface. So if we take 5 minutes now and then come back at 6 together to continue this conversation. But yeah, huge gratitude to you and thank you for coming and spending this time with us.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you all.